Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the day. My name is Rod Gilbert. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs and Procurement Practices at CCA. It's my pleasure today to be moderating that panel with our guest. With us today, Chris Lawrence. Chris is the President of the Manitoba Heavy Construction Association and also the Western Canada Road Builders and Heavy Construction Association. Dr. Paul Smittanen, President of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, and Carlo Day, Director of the Trade Investment Centre at the Canada West Foundation. You can find their bios on the app and all the information on our website. As you know, last year was very difficult, and Canada's economy has been hit really hard due to COVID-19. Furthermore, trade-enabling infrastructure is vulnerable to the impact of the extreme weather events. And we've seen it. I think you've lived it live here in British Columbia lately. The flooding and everything that we see now, like ice storm and wildfire, really, we see the impact on it. Canada is also faces prevailing threat to its economic and national security. The Buy America Clause, for example, the value clashes with China, and today, like the terrible thing happening in Ukraine with Russia invading Ukraine. So all these threats are also a threat to Canada. These present both an economic and national security concern, and are a continuous risk to Canada growth. In short, our trade-reliant economy is increasingly exposed to the global event. Over the last few months, in collaboration with Chris, under his leadership, with the Canadian Road Builder, Western Road Builder of Canada, and CCA, we've been working on an initiative on trade-enabling infrastructure. And really, the idea behind it was really to influence the federal government to reinvest towards like establishing a better trade-enabling infrastructure in Canada. So today we'll do a short presentation. So Chris, Carlo, and Paul will do a shorter presentation, and then we have a discussion about it. Maybe Chris, I'll invite you to start.
Sure. Thanks very much, Rod, and thank you to the CCU for hosting this session on trade diversity and its linkages to our economic and national security interests. The first part of my answer to the challenge of what we should be focusing in discussions with the federal government is persuading that Canada must significantly recapitalize in its trade corridor funding for the long-term strategic investment in trade-enabling infrastructure to support trade diversification and, by extension, Western Canada and Canada's economic growth. That strategy includes the Western Canada Trade Gateway and Corridor Initiative proposed by a coalition of national, regional, and provincial organizations led by the CCA, Western Canada Road Builders, and the Canada West Foundation. That coalition is urging the federal government to harness the indispensable role Western Canada plays in enabling trade with Asia and into the North American continent. It builds on past successes of trade corridor funding programs to expand access to global markets and in the process growing our economy. The second part of my answer is that Canada has to acknowledge that diversifying her global trade profile is important not just to our economic and social interests, but equally so to our national security interests. The security interest focus has always existed in the background, but its materiality has risen. There is a relationship between a strong trade-based economy and national security. A strong economy enables a respected foreign policy presence to advance and protect our national interests. And national security interests include the stability and protection of shared values, safety, democratic and human rights, economic, social, and political freedoms, and the freedom from fear, threat, and conflict. A strong economy, therefore, supports national security, which in turn enables a strong economy. Conversely, a weaker economy means fewer resources to protect national interests, placing the country and the protection of its values domestically and abroad at risk. We speak about trade diversification and national security, given Canada has not only weathered significant trade challenges, but now faces at least three areas of acute concern. First is Biden's focus on Buy America First, which explicitly threatens to undermine our economic prosperity, and the United States is our largest trading partner. Second, China's, our second largest trading partner, weaponization of trade, global bullying, reminds Canadians of a salient fact. We can neither be a rival to China, too large an economic and military partner, nor its partner. It has diametrically opposed human rights and democratic values to ours. So whatever our continued trade relationship with China, it must be with eyes wide open. And third is Putin's barbaric and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, testing world resolve for a rules-based civilization. So what is the issue? Dependence. Let me put it in some context. First, Canada's economy relies on trade for 65% of its GDP. Contrast that with 23% of the United States. Second, we are overly dependent on two trading partners, the United States and China. Canada's largest trading partner is the United States. 75% of our exports go to the United States, and 50% of our imports come from the United States. Historically, we've relied on friendly relations, the convenient proximity, and the direct access to the world's largest economy, but that's changing. And second, our second largest trading partner is China. 4% of our products go to China, 12% of our imports come from China, and China is Canada's fastest growing trade partner, recently increasing by 11% annually. These dependencies left unchecked leave us vulnerable to the diplomatic relations with each of the United States and China. Third, our foreign policy and international obligations have and will draw Canada into dispute, potentially to the detriment of trade relationships and therefore our economy. Fourth, Canada must diversify its trade to alleviate the dependence, vulnerability, and thereby protect our economic welfare and security interests. And fifth, Canada cannot allow its pursuit of trade diversification to water down our democratic values, national integrity, and reputation. We must carry the flag everywhere we go. So what is the risk? Vulnerability. With the United States, we see continued protectionism, country of origin labeling, tariffs, bring home the jobs, made in America, tax credits for vehicles only if all components are made in the United States, the infrastructure program with all of its components sourced from within the United States. We saw those sentiments explicitly repeated by President Biden in his March State of the Union address. That protectionism is not going away, and it will impact jobs and investment in Canada, and therefore our economic health. China's human rights abuses, weaponization of trade, and aggressive foreign policy affects our relations, including trade. Human rights abuses targeting Uyghur ethnic minorities that required Canada's response, resulting in reprisals, is a reality. A Canadian was jailed for life, and Canadian authorities were not even permitted at the trial. As Canada respected the terms of her extradition treaty with the United States, with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, China imposed trade sanctions on agriculture products and jailed the two Michaels as hostages. And China continues to threaten retaliation if Canada bans Huawei from participating in the 5G network. So what's the solution? Diversification. If we accept that a strong economy is not only a means to achieve a strong national security, but it is one of the objectives of pursuing a strong national security, then it follows that we must aggressively pursue global trade diversification. How? First, Canada, to its credit, has negotiated a series of free trade agreements, which approach follows an ally shoring practice of sourcing materials, goods, services, and products from countries that share similar values and a commitment to transparent international trade, a security consideration. Those include the Canada-UK Trade Agreement, which provides stability of trade between Canada and UK, our fifth largest trading partner. The CETA Agreement, providing access to the EU, one of the largest economies, and Canada's second largest trading bloc. The CPTPP, which provides access to 10 countries, Australia, Brunei, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. And of note, it eases further access to Japan, Canada's fourth largest trading partner. In addition, we must be mindful that Asia Pacific is the world's leading region of economic growth, offering big trade growth opportunities. Key takeaways: the fastest annual growing middle class is Indonesia, 7 million, India, 20 million, and China, 35 million. And this rate of growth exceeds their economy's capacities to fill domestic needs, creating export markets. Second, the growing exports to the above markets will require investment in strong gateway and corridor networks to raise the West's and Canada's trade profile in Asia to allow us to expand beyond China. And third, Canada has opportunities to further expand trade with Mexico, a country in a very similar position. Mexico is our third largest trading partner. And with CP's recent rail acquisitions, the North America and continent market are very much at play for growth. Let me close by highlighting the most immediate threat, bringing home the linkages between diversifying our trade and our economic and national security interests. And it is, of course, Putin's 1939 moment invasion of a free and sovereign Ukraine. It's a threat not just to Ukraine, but a defining moment for the West as a counterbalance to Russia's menacing sphere of influence expansion. Germany, as an example, is canceling the 11 billion Nord Stream pipeline from Russia, from which it imports 60% of its natural gas. And to further decouple from Russia, it will accelerate building 2 LNG terminals to diversify its domestic supply and concurrently accelerate transitioning to clean, renewable energy resources. Canada, the fifth largest producer of natural gas, has not a single facility for shipping LNG overseas. And so we cannot expand into this market nor contribute in that manner to global security. We must address this as a nation, and that does mean building trade corridors to make that proposition possible. Given the above, Canada must accept that sustained strategic investment in trade gateways and corridors is pivotal to our national interest, including 1, a globally recognized efficient network of trade gateways of corridors; 2, expanded trade activity and therefore economic growth; 3, an enhanced global reputation as a reliable trading partner and desirable investment market; 4, shield our economy from market dependencies and weaponizing of trade by hostile jurisdictions; and 5, the protection of our national security interests. In conclusion, I do hope that I've made the case for why Canada must act upon this self-interest reality. Diversifying Canada's global trade profile through strategic investments in trade gateways and corridors is important not just to our economic and social welfare, but equally so to our national security interests. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Rod.
So now that we got that delivery, and now we should put that in numbers. And on this, I'd like to invite Paul to explain, to put that like really in context and explain what it means. I just want to also mention that last year when we developed our answer to the National Infrastructure Assessment, Paul worked with us and developed good content that still today the federal government is using to develop their next stage. So Paul, it's up to you.
Great.
One of your speakers is positive.
Good afternoon. So what we're going to be talking about is just some basic facts
of the level of infrastructure investment in Canada across road, rail, air and water, which you can think of as trade corridor investments. And as you can see by the heading here, the environment of lower investment and uncertainty, and there's probably two key takeaways that I'd like you to have over the next 3 or 4 slides. The first is Canada invests a level of infrastructure at only 50% of what's actually required in trade corridors when compared to its international peers. Only 50%. And that's been occurring now for the last 20 years. The second takeaway I'd like to give you is the level of uncertainty behind that funding is almost 4 times more than the average of its international peers. In fact, the uncertainty of infrastructure funding in Canada is twice as much as exists in Mexico, just to give you an idea. So let's get into some numbers. What these lines are, what this graph is here is essentially the level of infrastructure investment relative to the types of investment that I just mentioned, and we'll call them trade corridor investments. And as you can see, from 2000 to 2010, it's been slowly coming down and degrading. And in Canada, Canada will invest about $21 billion in these kinds of infrastructure, where we in fact require about $42 billion if we were to keep up with our international competitors and our international peers. For instance, Australia and the UK is twice as much, more than twice as much as the infrastructure investments that we make here in Canada. And for instance, that represents about 300,000 jobs that we don't have because we're underinvesting in critical infrastructure that supports exports and trades and things of that nature. So we sort of touched on that the level of investment is about half of what it should be. And when you look at infrastructure investment in Canada, it is a political football. There are reasons for this situation in Canada, and the uncertainty tends to come from the top down. And we can explain that through the discussion later. But this gives rise to uncertainty. You get the flip-flopping of investments and the volatility of investments, and that's what this graph is here. And you can't plan to that level of volatility. Like, infrastructure takes 10 to 20 years in terms of a runway in order to be able to get it right. But if you keep flipping and flopping, it actually degrades the rate of return that we can get from our infrastructure investments. And there is a paper that's written on this. It's in fact, the uncertainty to infrastructure investment has the same economic impact that it would have if we stopped immigration completely, right? Which is something that we've seen over the course of the last 2 years. The level of volatility or uncertainty behind Canada's infrastructure investments is the highest amongst its peers. As I've mentioned, it's 2 times higher than Mexico, which is just, when we looked at that statistic, it was flabbergasted. It's 3 times higher than Australia and the UK. And in fact, the level of uncertainty is 7 times higher than the United States. So how can we as a country, with all of its various sovereign interests and competing provinces and competing governments, levels of government, how can we actually squeeze more juice out of a fixed budget? How can we actually improve upon this? And this is one of the big questions, and it's chronic across the country, unfortunately. And it's no wonder that that over 30% of businesses report transportation infrastructure as a key obstacle to exporting. And in some regions, this can be as high as half of all businesses complaining that infrastructure is an impediment to them doing business externally outside the country. And this is all Statistics Canada information. There's no opinions exhibited in these slides. This is just fact. And it comes at a very, very high economic toll, which we can talk about again in the discussion. So the investment levels, the 2 points, the investment levels and the level of uncertainty or volatility is of major concern, and is one of the biggest barriers to Canada's economic success, but also its export success. As I've mentioned, it's about half of what Australians, I'm also a citizen of Canada as well, I'm a little torn at the moment, and the UK, for instance. And you can imagine the United Kingdom's a much smaller country, it's an island compared to the vastness of Canada, and yet we spend half of what the United Kingdom spends on this important infrastructure. And as a measure of uncertainty and volatility is indicative of the absence of the execution and a long-term plan. And when you start to look at long-term plans that are being developed across China, across the US, UK and Australia, we are woefully behind. We're about 20 years behind on even thinking about a long-term plan. And the core principles of infrastructure investment, it needs to be urgently addressed. Thanks for your time, and we'll take your questions shortly.
Thank you, Paul. And just an editorial comments on that. It's kind of funny. So when we were looking at the numbers and like the uncertainty and like the big bump and boost, and it seems to relate to the electoral cycle, but that's just me like talking. So Carlo, you're up next.
Could be cabinet shuffle cycle.
Exactly. So you're up next, and over the last few months with the Canada West Foundation, we've been working on a report to be published very soon. That would be called Shovel Ready to Shovel Worthy. And it's not to put pressure on you, Carlo, but I think there's a lot of expectation to the report. So it's up to you.
Thanks. I don't know exactly how to take that. The report's been delayed. So Rod has every right to give me a little push to make sure that this report comes out sometime before the second coming. I'm confident that we're going to beat that mark. Now, the report will be out the end of this month, and there'll be massive publicity around that. But let me start. Canada West Foundation. We're Western Canada's think tank, assuring that the 4 Western provinces have a voice, not just in Ottawa, but in Washington, D.C., in Tokyo, in Mexico City, in Europe, in Brussels. So we look at Western interest across the globe, not just in the Canadian context. The strong West and the strong Canada is the ethos of the Canada West Foundation. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. I run the Trade and Investment Center, and when not doing that, my other job is to make Chris Lawrence look good. So I've worked with Chris long enough to be able to make that joke and not have Chris come off the stage at me. So as Rod mentioned, I'm going to talk about a report that's the culmination of 8 years of in-depth research on the problems with Canada's trade infrastructure, the importance of Canada's trade infrastructure, and more importantly, what can be done to fix the problems I'm going to outline. So in terms of a hopeful message, someone was looking for hope. There is hope. There is a path to getting back in the top 10 of global infrastructure. We were there before, we can return. The path is clear. We've done 8 years of work on identifying what those steps are, and I'll get to that. But first, you give a pinhead money to do research and you invite him to speak, you're going to get pinhead sort of graphs and charts. But Chris mentioned the importance of trade. And when we were working on this report, my boss, who's a former university dean, at one point said, make the case that trade really is important. You've just stated the numbers. So we did some modeling to look at exports and imports tracked with Canadian GDP. And we actually found a leading impact, not a lagging impact, but a leading impact. We depend on exports and imports moving goods, people, money, and ideas to and from Canada, not just as an abstract concept, as a percentage of our GDP, but you see it year in and year out. So 4 points for you. One, the importance of trade. These numbers, in addition, we've got tons of information on this in the report, but Chris mentioned that the Americans rely for two-way trade for under 20%, just under 20% of their GDP, and in Canada, it's over 60. If you look at the state and provincial level, in Alberta, 30%, 31% of Alberta's GDP comes from exports. You go across the border to Montana, that figure drops to 3.28%. You look at Saskatchewan, it's 32%. You go across the border to North Dakota, a state with oil, a state with agricultural resources, it drops down to 11, 13%. Even in Ontario and Quebec, the numbers, the contrast is similar. Here in BC, BC is an outlier in Canada. It's about 15% of BC's GDP comes from exports, but in Washington, it's under 10%. So you go across jurisdiction after jurisdiction after jurisdiction. It's not just an abstract national concept. It's something that hits every province, the importance of trade. The importance of trade for construction, point 2. The importance for the nation, point 1, for construction. When we talk about trade, you tend to think of moving goods, cattle, canola, corn, containers. The reality is trade is the movement of 4 factors of production. People are another component of trade, trade and services. Money, investment is another component of trade, and ideas, information is the 4th component of trade. We obsess and we think about trade as just the movement of goods. We think about building for roads, but for construction, there are opportunities in each facet of trade. Trade is shifting globally. The trade and services and investment are growing across the planet as a portion of trade. But that doesn't mean that the importance of roads are going to be less, no. But it does mean that there are opportunities as the other areas of trade grow for the construction industry. So you think of moving of people, everything involved in housing immigrants, but also moving people, airports, facilities to move people. As trade and services grows, so does the service sector, banking, insurance, engineering. Those services require moving people and building facilities in Canada. As that trade grows, so does opportunities for the construction industry. Money, I'm not sure, I'm still working on an example with money, but with information, the Cascadia corridor that runs from Portland up to Vancouver is a joint economic unit. That unit needs fiber desperately. So there are opportunities, and there have been efforts to try and lay fiber from Portland up to Vancouver. Those sorts of opportunities come on the information side. We need 5G in Canada. If we're going to have a successful agricultural community, an agricultural community that can thrive in current times, we're going to need 5G in rural areas. So in each area, these are just one example, but as you think of trade changing, you can't think just of corn, cattle, and canola. You've got to think about the opportunities for construction that show up as trade grows. So let's get on to the report. The importance of trade we've laid out. But over the past decade, we've had troubling signs that our trade infrastructure is in trouble. The World Economic Forum does an annual survey of users in each country, shippers, transporters, and others, of their views of their country's infrastructure. In Canada, you can see the constant decline from a high in the top 10 during the Asia-Pacific Gateway days down into the 20s recently. If you were to look just at transport infrastructure, the subcategory, we dropped to 32nd. We've gone from top 10 globally to 32nd. The Americans have dropped 2 points from 11 to 13. You know this. You don't know that we've dropped to 32nd, but you know the Americans have dropped 2 points because Buttigieg and Biden won't shut up about it. Every time they're on TV talking about infrastructure, they mention this. In Canada, it's gone unmentioned. But you look at how other countries have done. Countries that Rod mentioned that have invested in national plans, in taking infrastructure seriously. And China closing the gap slowly on us. This is troubling. There's worse news, and I promise there's good news at the end of this. If you look at surveys that the World Bank does of our customers, so where the World Economic Forum asks people in Canada what they think of their trade infrastructure, the World Bank takes our top 5 trade partners and asks those top 5 trade partners what businesses there think about Canada's trade infrastructure, because they have to deal with us getting goods and shipping goods to us. The World Bank numbers show a significant drop for Canada as well, contrasted with gains elsewhere. So this clearly is a problem that users and customers are telling us. This problem also shows up in work that we've done, looking at comparative cross-jurisdictional studies, and the European auditors. The EU just did a study of major economies and trade infrastructure planning, and they found that Canada stuck out like a sore thumb as the one country that didn't do planning, that didn't have national plans, that didn't use intelligence in infrastructure. So the issues are, if you were to show these to a minister, you would get the typical government response. Our government has spent so much money on infrastructure. We funded so many projects. Everything we've done to date has accompanied these drops in our rankings. So what we're doing, the market is telling us that what we're doing isn't working for it. So we clearly need a change. And you look at other countries that have started to do better, and you kind of have the idea that maybe there's something there for us to pick up on. So as Chris mentioned, the report that we've been working on, from shovel ready to shovel worthy, how to get Canada back in the top 10 of global trade infrastructure. The first point, before any of the ones listed, is to realize that we have a problem, that what we've been doing hasn't been working. And let me be very clear about this. If shovel ready is the mantra that you use to describe infrastructure, if it in any way influences how you're picking projects, you are starting with an admission of failure. Again, shovel ready is an admission, is starting with an admission that you cannot or will not do better than simply funding stuff because it's convenient, because it's lying around. It means you're not choosing shovel worthy, which is choosing projects that have strategic importance, that tie to trade agreements and long-term trade concerns, projects that can demonstrate return on investment, projects that fit in with other investments for the national structure to improve fluidity, to improve the national system. Even in times of crisis, shovel ready is a problem. In times of crisis, if you have a shovel-worthy system, you have a pipeline of projects ready to go. And you simply need to accelerate funding from projects that meet criteria of national significance that have been shown to have real value. Shovel-ready, on the other hand, is an admission that you cannot or you will not do that, despite the fact that other jurisdictions have done this. So we lay out the 7 steps in the report. I'm not going to go over them here because I want to make other points, but there are concrete steps that other jurisdictions have taken, that Canada took 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, when we were in the global top 10. And this report lays out how to do that. So what does intelligence and data and infrastructure look like? One thing that Transport Canada did, they modeled the impact of the European Union trade agreement on Canada's trade infrastructure. They didn't do this for the CPTPP agreement, the agreement that's important to the West. Of course, they're not going to do that. So we had to pick it up. We improved upon the modeling. and we run the numbers for the TPP. What you get out of these numbers are things like this. You can see the additional impact that a trade agreement will have on ports of clearance for goods. It's fairly simple. My hat's off to Transport Canada, if anyone from Transport Canada is here, for having done this the first time. But they didn't repeat it. And there's no hope or knowledge or certainty that they'll do it again if we sign other trade agreements. It was a one-off. This is the type of thing that other jurisdictions do regularly. It's assured that they're going to do this. There's systems in place to make sure that this stuff comes out. It's also having knowledge of a national system. This, again, is work that Transport Canada has done in terms of regional transportation assessments, looking at movements of goods, identifying choke points. This stuff is in our report with the permission of Transport Canada. So a good sign, a sign of hope is that we do have some elements of being able to get our trade infrastructure back in the top 10 globally. The problem is it's dependent upon election cycles, cabinet shuffles. We do something for one government, a new government comes in and throws it out because it's the old government. You look at our competitors, they have permanent structures with the private sector involved to make long-term decisions about trade infrastructure. Project pipelines are a standard feature, not just in the UK and not just in Australia, but places like Malaysia. We're seeing these becoming global best practice, but not in Canada. Finally, the issue that we have with this lack of intelligence is not just a Canadian problem. It's a Canadian problem in a North American problem. Chris mentioned that 75%? With the price of oil, we're now getting close to 80. 80% of our exports go to the US. But you think about this, the NAFTA agreement and trade agreements aren't just about cutting 2 cents a ton off the price of canola or corn going back and forth between countries. It's about making goods together. Think about the auto sector in North America. NAFTA has enabled us to have, well, the auto pact, but NAFTA too, has enabled us to have a North American automobile production system where we make cars together. Cattle out here, we make beef together. We ship goods back and forth across the border. We're not the only trade bloc that does this. If you take a look at the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, they also make goods together, taking the best and the cheapest from each country to make goods together to sell internationally. They move goods back and forth. They move people back and forth. They have the Inter-American Development Bank to help them, to collect data on how goods move between countries, on what infrastructure exists in each country, on how the entire integrated supply and production chain amongst all 4 countries work, and where is the best place to make investment? Where is investment needed? Not to make Peru more successful, but to make this trade bloc more successful. You look at the African Free Trade Association. You've got the African Development Bank, independent, long-term collection of information, advice on where you need to invest to make the bloc more competitive. You look at ASEAN. You've got the Asian Development Bank doing this for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. You look at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, of which China is the largest member. You have the Chinese-created Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You go to Europe, the European Union has intelligence, information, objective third-party advice to make them more competitive globally. And even CARICOM has the Caribbean Development Bank. And here in North America, what do we have as independent information about how we make goods together, how we compete with all these other trade blocs? Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we have. We fund, in Canada and the US, we fund the Inter-American Development Bank. We fund the African Development Bank. We fund the Asian Development Bank. We're a member of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We fund other trade blocs to beat our brains out internationally and to become more competitive. Yet we fight over building the Gordie Howe Bridge. If you're trying to do something similar between Colombia and Peru, you've got the Inter-American Development Bank to play referee, to provide objective advice, to make the case, to provide financing, to facilitate it. If you're trying to build air linkages in RCEP, you've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, not just to provide money, but the intelligence, the data. We don't know how goods move throughout the integrated supply and production chains in North America. We barely know what moves at the border. COVID's showing us that we do not have data on how goods cross the border. Every week, those of us that work on the border were scrambling with questions from the media, asking for data about movement of goods across the border. StatsCan data is out of date by the time we get it, and it's just not thorough enough. Yet every place else with whom we compete has this. So we've got a problem in Canada that we can fix with the 7 steps laid out in the report. It's not pie in the sky. Other countries have done this. We did this at some point. It's eminently doable. We just need the political will to move beyond thinking in terms of election cycles and thinking in terms with which all of you are familiar, the longer term cycles for trade infrastructure and for construction. If we can do that, we can get back into the global top 10, and we've got the 7 steps to get there. But on top of that, even if we fix the Canadian problem, ladies and gentlemen, we still have the North American problem to deal with. We're in a trade bloc where 75, 80% of our trade's going, and we're facing increasing global pressures from other trade blocs, and especially the Chinese that are getting their act together. We haven't gotten our act together in Canada, and we haven't gotten our act together in North America. But at least for the Canadian side, there is a path forward, and we're hopeful that the government's going to pick it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. I think we have only 2 minutes left, and I'll just ask a question to everyone. I think it's very, with all that being said, so often what we see and what we've seen over the last few years is like investing in infrastructure. It's like it's almost a dirty word. Like it's not trending. It's not trendy. It's not something that government are other than election cycle like shovel ready. So how can we change that? How can we make infrastructure? How can we have government understand that infrastructure is not just about building something, but it's about what is contributing to the society, what is contributing to Canada? Maybe I'll start with you, Paul.
Well, that's part of the very heart of the problem is infrastructure is not sexy. It's like you build a new home and you're focused on the finishings, not what's behind the wall holding the house up and everything else. And I don't think that Canada can, under the current circumstances, create a solidarity around this particular topic because it's easy for politicians to kick the can down the road. And we chronically underinvest in infrastructure, so much so that we're actually passing a debt onto our children in the form of about $350,000 for a person starting employment today at 20 years old. By the time they get to retirement, they will be short $350,000 of what they could have had if we had a proper infrastructure policy.
Carlo, with everything that you said, why investment in the trade corridor would be not only good like for Western Canada, but it's good for every Canadian?
So the answer to that gets to your first question. If the government staked its reputation on this diversification strategy, on increasing exports, they've hung their hat on that. If they do not improve the efficiency of trade corridors, given what our international customers are telling us, they are destined for failure. So that case has to be made and has to be made publicly. We support the government's efforts to increase diversification. We support the government's efforts to increase exports, but our customers are telling us they don't think we can do it. So how do you think you're going to have success with a product that your customers are telling you isn't going to make it? We have to shame the government. Canada loves world rankings. We love being admired. We love being followed. But this is a story that should shame any government. And they just haven't been called on it. Again, the Americans dropped 2 points, and you can't get the president to shut up about it. The American media is taken with it. We dropped 20 freaking points, and no one knows. No one seems to care. Quick story. When I was doing the research, I called the World Bank to ask them about their methodology and how they were doing this. And the researcher with whom I was speaking said, we've been getting calls from the Canadian government. They're calling to complain about the methodology. Not what do we learn from this, not how do we improve upon it. They don't like the numbers, so they're complaining about how we come up with the numbers. This has got to be a grassroots movement. It's got to be people shaming the government and calling them out. And not this particular government, because this is a problem 10 years in the making. So yes, we're the Canada West Foundation, but no, we're not just kicking liberals. This is a problem that's been 10 years in the making. And it's a problem that stands in sharp contrast to everyone else. So yeah, shame them.
Chris, just final words. And so all the work we've been doing with Canada West Foundation, with Paul, what do you think would be a good outcome? Like what we expect? Like what would be the next steps? Because as you know, CCA have been very pushing on a 25 years plan, a report to the government on the national infrastructure, but was well received. They took a lot of a recommendation. So what do you think should happen?
Well, first of all, we need to accept that advocacy is a marathon, never a sprint. So giving up is simply not an option. Secondly, and I'm going to make Carlo look really good here, he came up with the phrase which makes absolute sense. And I'm paraphrasing, and Carlo can correct me. But it's basically this statement. There's the infrastructure that we want, like parks and recreation, infrastructure that we need, like healthcare and education. And then there's the infrastructure that pays for it all, and it's trade. And if there's anything that's been demonstrated through the presentations this afternoon is exactly that if we cannot maintain and expand and diversify our global trade profile, our economic and social interests wane. And we put at risk our national security interests. And we become an indispensable, not a dispensable player in the global arena. Who cares what Canada says? We neither have economic might, foreign policy presence, because we don't have the strength behind it and the strength of an economy that can influence and a foreign policy that can be respected. So there are some immediate steps that we are taking. And again, marathon, not a sprint. We're going to be in discussions with the provincial government of Manitoba shortly because Manitoba will host the Council of the Federation meetings in 2023. An objective is to try to understand how we can move the Western Canada Trade Gateway Corridor file to the offices of the premiers. No disrespect intended, but not the ministers of transportation. The premiers need to buy into this. They need to make it their respective government's number one priority. Second, how do we get it to a meeting for meaningful discussion at the Western Premiers Conference or at a meeting of the newest partnership, which is the same body of premiers? And ultimately, how do we get it onto the agenda of the Council of the Federation, which Premier Stephenson chairs in 2023? Concurrently, with the CCA, we've written to the Minister of Federal Transportation, inviting a discussion around the Western Canada trade file. The CCA in its pre-budget submission has profiled the importance of the federal government committing to long-term, sustained, strategic, incremental, transparent, objective funding and investment in trade gateways and corridors as proposed by the Western Canada Trade Gateway Corridor as an example. Not just focusing on Western Canada trade gateways and corridors, it needs to be a nation-building, nation investment effort. And through that kind of investment, we get the return because our country is stronger, our social values are protected, our freedoms are protected, and our security is secure.
Thank you, Chris. On these words, so thank you very much for being part of it with us today. Carlo, Chris, Paul, thank you very much. I can just say that issue will be on our advocacy radar for the next few years, and we'll keep working on that at CCA. Thank you very much, everyone.